Hi, morning everybody. Thanks for coming along. I am Vicky and I am the founder and one of the directors of Peer Hub, a new user-led organisation in County Durham. And one of the things that we're really interested in is understanding the experiences of people, user-led approaches to mental health, or those kinds of like community type approaches, and as part of that, really understanding the experiences of people as part of research. So one of the things that we really wanted to look at as part of our launch series, we launched last Monday. It's been a hectic couple of weeks but very exciting, and one of the things that we wanted to really think about is subjective analysis, using experience as part of research, and just thinking through some of the things as a user-led organisation we might be able to do when we're thinking about either evaluating our work or getting involved in research. So I'm going to ask the speakers to introduce themselves in a second, but first, just to demonstrate that the chat works, I'm going to drop in there our PayPal donate button so you can click on the link. This is a Pay What You Feel webinar, and some people just haven't had the chance to do that, so it's in there. There's no pressure, but if you do feel like sending us a little bit, we're trying to put together some peer support groups at the moment, and every pound, I would say every penny, but not in 2021, every pound helps. So just want to get us started by asking people to introduce themselves. I'm going to go around on my screen through the speakers, and I'm going to start with you, Peter. So if you would just like to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about you and your work and what you're going to talk about this morning.
Hi everybody, it's nice to be here, and thanks Vicky, and thanks for asking me. So I'm Peter, and I've got a long involvement as a mental health service user with both the Disabled People's Movement and the Survivor Movement. I'm involved in an organisation called Shaping Our Lives. Please check our website out. And I also work very part-time at the University of East Anglia, and I carry out research wearing those two hats. And I got interested in research and our knowledge as survivors quite some time ago, and because I had a professional role as a researcher as well as being a survivor researcher, and I began to realize that research, which has been regarded as something very special, very proper, something scientific, which is formally seen as the best way to create knowledge. Traditionally, it was called positivist research, and it had these three important values: that it should be neutral. That means that the person doing it shouldn't be biased in any way through being involved in what they're studying. It should be objective, so they shouldn't be influenced by their feelings or opinions or emotions. Cool, dispassionate. And there should be distance. They should be some distance away from the issue that they were focusing on. But it took me a while, but eventually I twigged, of course, that meant that people who knew nothing about, for example, being a survivor, or indeed being a woman, or being Black, or being LGBTQ, whatever, people with that direct experience, people who didn't have it, were therefore seen as better people to be studying it. And because they weren't affected, we cannot say as survivors that we're neutral. We can't say we're objective in the sense it doesn't impact on us, and we can't say that we're a distance away from it. And what was the really important conclusion for me, which I feel is desperately important? It's important for research, but it's so much more important that if you start off as a group that faces oppression, and we can see ourselves as survivors, but many more groups, and then you're also told you face that discrimination, but then you're also told that as a knower, someone who can find things out, you're also inferior because you are not neutral, objective, and distant. And so what you know from living it, and what you find out is not as good as someone who knows nothing about it from their life. Then you're facing actually another whole level of discrimination as a knower, as someone who's got experiential knowledge. And I think that's a kind of a shocking reality, and it is a reality, because we know still that formally research is very much premised on the basis that those kind of values are the best ones, and the kinds of techniques associated with them how we can get the most reliable knowledge. And I felt when I first thought about this that, in fact, it should be, we should ask the question, is it not indeed the other way around, that the most reliable, significant and helpful knowledge is more likely to come from people who cannot make that claim that they're neutral, objective and distance, but who are close to it, who have a subjective understanding and have a realization through their direct engagement. So that's the point I wanted to make, because that's what for me has been most important about this. Thanks, Vicky.
Thanks, Peter. And I think that there's some stuff that we're really going to go in more detail about that and about our understandings about research as we move through the webinar this morning. Kath, would you like to introduce yourself and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks very much, Vicky, for inviting me. Vicky and I met recently trying to find some money for a bid, and that continues. So I'm Catherine Swainston, and I am a senior lecturer in psychology at Teesside University, and I am a registered health psychologist. So my role is predominantly academic, and I do a lot of research, and my focus is kind of my passion really is women's health. But my focus for a long time has been the lived experience and working with groups of individuals whose voices really have not been heard before, and really trying to kind of work with them in collaboration to get their stories told. As part of my role at the university, I'm also the chair of our School of Social Sciences, Humanities and Law Research Ethics and Integrity Committee, and I'm vice chair of the university's Ethics Committee too. So I have a fair bit of experience kind of looking at this from lots of different angles, kind of as a researcher myself, but also from the side of an ethics committee. So hopefully I'll be able to add some useful thoughts into the conversation today.
I would think so, Kath. Thank you. From how we've worked together so far, I think there's some really good stuff that we can talk about around your experiences in the university setting, from the ethics and also from the research that you've been doing. Alison, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about you and the work you do.
Okay, so I'm Alison Faulkner. I've shared probably a similar timeline to Peter. I think we're much of an age really, but so I have a similar sort of long time of being involved in survivor research and what it means to bring experiential knowledge into the mental health research sort of arena. But I was thinking as Peter was talking, and I didn't want to repeat the same things that he was saying because it would be so easy for me to do that. But I just reflect on, I had more of a social research sort of background. So for a couple of years, for example, I worked at what is now called the National Centre for Social Research. And in those days, I mean, I did take part in a very historically interesting piece of research, which was to talk to people about their sex lives as part of the research that was going on to inform what was going on at that time, AIDS, a different pandemic, basically. And actually in those days, in the qualitative research unit there, it was important for people to share some aspects of their identity with the interviewees. So as a lesbian, I interviewed other lesbians and asking them about their sex lives. It's quite funny, but it was actually very difficult as well. And during that time, in that social research environment, it was quite common for interviewers to be matched to interviewees on basic demographic details. But when I came subsequently later to try to apply the same sort of experience to, actual experience of mental distress in the as interviewers, those same people I'd worked with in that social research environment were quite very, very negative about the fact that this would impact on the objectivity of the research interview. And that was really interesting to me because it was like your experience as a woman or as a Black person or as a lesbian could be important, but not your experience as somebody with mental distress. So it's a different academic, I think it's important to sort of recognize that different academic, and that was not so academic, but was semi-academic disciplines have got very different attitudes towards these different elements of what experience is important and what matters, suddenly the fact that I might have, and did then subsequently have, quite extensive experience of using mental health services. So I became a survivor researcher over a period of time. And that became so very important to me. It sort of feels like an element of social justice, that those of us with experience of mental distress have the opportunity to put our knowledge into the research field, as Peter said, definitely. And I think, yeah, this has just become a terribly important element of my whole working and personal life. So that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. And I think, like, one of the things that I'm really interested in digging into today, so my background is in intelligence analysis, and one of the things that we do as intelligence analysts, so we work in crime analysis and work on projects like trying to work out what the policing role is around issues like child sexual exploitation, human trafficking, organised crime, that kind of thing. And we would use research, but one of the things that's really important when you're in a role that's trying to determine what you're going to do is the value that the research brings to action, and the value that the research brings to actually having an impact on the outcomes for people, not and also obviously for the organisation, but primarily for people in the community. And we learn a whole lot of techniques as intelligence analysts on how to identify our own biases and ensure that what we're doing is that we're testing rigorously the evidence that we're making decisions on. There's a real focus on objectivity in the action, like in the determining an action from the research. One of the things that I've found is when I was looking at research as an analyst is that a lot of the research that I would look at wouldn't have that robust testing of what is the research you're bringing. And you can go through, even just in an abstract of a research paper, you can go through and identify, well, that's an assumption that this research is based on, and that's an assumption. And so my question, and I'm going to start with Peter, is there objective research in mental health at all, or is there just like there's research where people are identifying that they're bringing something of themselves, and there's research where it's hidden? Oh, you're muted, Peter.
My first thoughts about this were when me and my partner were having our first baby, and she found this book by a woman who's become a very famous academic, Anne Oakley, and it was called On Becoming a Mother, I think. And all she'd done, Anne Oakley, who was a conventional academic, but on this occasion, she'd just spoken to people she knew, women who were having babies. And I mean, I can't say much about having a baby. I've just watched them come. I haven't actually had a baby myself. I've never been very keen after watching on having a baby myself, but that hasn't arisen. But what Susie said was how incredibly helpful this book was, because it was all these women themselves talking about having babies. And what Anne Oakley said is, we cannot come to each other in an objective way. She wrote that as a woman, because we are subjective. So what she said, I would agree with, that we are subjects. And what I found really interesting is when I've had little chances to talk to natural scientists, people who study things, you know, like we regard as hard and stone or whatever, you know, is they're increasingly interested in participation and participatory approaches, because they're not assuming anymore that it's like Newton, an objective science as it was once imagined. Just one last thing to say, because I'm keen on motorbikes and old motorbikes. The British motorbike industry, which failed disastrously in the 1970s and 80s, they set up this big research centre towards the end of their life. And somebody commented that when they looked in the parking bays, there were no motorbikes. The people who were working there were all coming cars. And this place became an absolute legend for producing crap motorcycles. And I'll leave it there. That's what I think.
And I do think it's so important, because I think I'm going to come to you, Alison, and then I'm going to ask Kath in a second. But first, I want to speak to you, Alison, because you mentioned about social change. And if we're talking about, you know, mental health research, isn't mental health research done for the sake of doing research, or shouldn't be. What we should be doing is trying to find out and understand better what works and what we should, and how we should be moving mental health services towards better outcomes for people, better experiences for people. So then thinking about that element of social change and what we can bring, is it not essential that we reflect on our own experiences anyway, to think about how we might inhibit that change if we don't? Does that make sense? Like, if we're looking at
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a way I was kind of half wanting to just follow on slightly from the issue of objectivity, because one of the things that I have a particular bee in my bonnet about is asking the right questions at the beginning of any piece of research, and how that is where the subjectivity starts. And that subjectivity can apply to surveys and natural science. The whole gamut of research is affected by the questions, the measures that you decide to use, the questions that you decide to ask. And asking, I mean, I just have this big thing that, you know, if you don't involve people with the lived experience of the thing in question at the beginning and ask the right questions of the other people, you know, the rest of the people that you're going to engage in the research, you've lost massive ground already. And yes, it's subjective. Whatever decisions you make are never going to be objective, but you can be open and honest about the way in which you set up the question, you design the questions with information from these different sources. You can say what your bias is. But so many researchers believe themselves to be objective, seriously do believe that they are objective.
And I find that,
yeah.
I do find that fascinating, the idea that, you know, particularly I think in mental health research, where we're literally talking about an experience that can't be observed externally, it's an internal experience, and the idea of being able to consider someone else's subjective experience objectively and understand it, translate it into a way that can then be kind of understood through a filter that doesn't involve like other mental health experiences. Do you know what I mean? Or assuming that there isn't a mental health experience.
The mental health experience is itself subjective, and we have no objective measures for it. So where else can we possibly start other than with the lived experience, I feel?
Yeah, exactly. And one of the reasons I wanted to come to you, Kath, was to thinking about the different research methods that are used in universities and in research around psychology and stuff, and how much of it is drawn from other disciplines, and how much of an opportunity there is, either as a research team or sitting on an ethics committee, to really focus in on, well, where have the decisions have been made on how to start this project, and where are we taking our guidance from as to what good research looks like, if not from people with lived experience, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the issues that we have really around this whole debate is the discourse that is used. And I think that often we see, statistics is therefore objective, and we very much kind of pitch that against, the subjectiveness of, patient stories, of the lived experience. And I kind of feel, sometimes what happens, I mean, if we think about kind of the three pillars of that kind of quality healthcare is built on, we have that patient safety, we have the clinical effectiveness, and we have that patient experience. And yet while they should all have equal standing, I think the patient experience often doesn't, because of the way that we view this objectivity subjectivity debate. And I think what happens is, when you see things as patient experiences as more subjective, then they become perceived to be a bit less important than that clinical safety, than the effectiveness, where actually they're all interlinked and are all of equal importance. So I think, this kind of soft evidence versus hard evidence debate, I mean, we could talk about it all day, couldn't we? But I think there needs to be a shift in how we see this, and that we actually see approaches as being complementary often, rather than in complete opposition to each other. So, I mean, thinking about how we draw from other perspectives, we certainly do, and certainly within psychology, we draw on research from sociology, from criminology, from social policy, all of those different aspects. And I think over time, each of those individual areas has kind of brought about kind of looking at the survivor movement, service user movement. I mean, I actually remember back, I mean, when I started my teaching career 15 years ago, I ended up with a module around clinical and social perspectives in mental health. So I, as part of that module, decided I would teach some stuff to my students around service user movement and the change over time and patient experiences, particularly within mental health. And this was seen as quite a radical thing to do. And you know, and the students were quite, in some ways, were quite shocked that I was even teaching it, and in other ways were shocked that this wasn't, you know, that service users weren't just naturally part of decision-making processes. So I've certainly seen a shift over time within my own profession as to how we perceive that. I think it comes down to how we see the value of people's experiences. And I think that we are moving in the right direction with that. But you know, it's surprising that, you know, in 15 years, I think it's only really now that I see this embedded much more. And I think one of the I'm going to say sad things for me in a way is when we think about, in university terms, the research assessment exercises. You know, that statistical research is always given a higher ranking, a higher rating. So, you know, when you're doing a lot of work around patient experiences and survivor research, that's automatically kind of on a hierarchy. It's seen much further down the list. And I think, you know, we really need to address that and redress that balance.
I think we do. And I think one of the things that you know, I'm seeing like in the chat that like this conversation around like qualitative stuff, quantitative stuff, statistics and subjective understanding experiences. And one of the things that really kind of frustrates me in this work is the real focus on that something doesn't add value if it hasn't got statistical significance. So then how that then falls down the line to harmful care. Mm-hmm. So rather than looking for the experience of what works, bearing in mind that mental health is a subjective experience, that we're trying, that research tries to narrow stuff down to statistical significance, picking and selecting people for research who are, where you're able to create a homogenous group. So that means that marginalized people get excluded, so that you can derive a statistical significance for an intervention. But actually, the group that are going to use that are going to be marginalized people. They're going to be people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. They're going to be people with lots of different experiences. And by striving for statistical significance, even if it's just by a narrow margin, what we're doing is almost kind of ignoring the fact that when it comes to a general population, there's a capacity to cause harm. And that there's a human rights movement out there for a reason. And part of the reason is because of the fact that the way that we test what works traditionally isn't actually working to create good outcomes for people. So I want to come back to Peter, to think about this kind of idea of like, when you're building a study, when you're thinking about what questions am I going to ask, who am I going to ask them of, how am I going to know what works, what kind of things would you think about as somebody who's got lived experience as to the kind of things that you're looking to measure and to measure in a way that contributes to a conversation of what works, you know?
I have to be honest, I tend not to think like that. And I think that that's not a good idea if you're wanting to get grant funding. And I can't imagine how many research projects I've been part of, research projects which I think probably many of us would think were worthwhile trying, where we've never got anywhere because we've been told we haven't set things out in enough detail. And we haven't set things out in enough detail because we've made it absolutely clear that what we're trying to do is not preset everything, but make it possible for there to be wider involvement. And it's really funny, I don't know if, because I've been more careful and less anxious to waste too much time more recently. But, you know, when like a group of us as service users would put together a proposal, you'd sometimes get a response which suggested you needed more user involvement because we obviously haven't signaled clearly enough that we are matter-of-factly all actually with that experience, and they're looking for the compartment of those particular people. So I suppose it can sound like a kind of a disclaiming of responsibility, but my first thought is obviously I'll have ideas, we all have ideas. And sometimes when you're actually at a stage of bringing people together, then you want to have a backup set of ideas so that it can set the ball rolling, or, you know, people can say that's rubbish, and then help them come up with their own things. And, but I do try to be, which I don't think you're encouraged to often as a researcher, to be as relaxed as possible, you know, and calm, that you haven't got to have it all worked out. And I think the best research projects, as somebody once said to me, a disabled researcher said, you always know what you're going to find out before you even start a research project. And that worried me. And just like I'm uncertain about where we might be heading in some senses, the most exciting research projects I've been involved in often have been ones where you've had no idea when you've got there what you were going to find out. I mean, one of those, which was a survivor-led project I carried out with other survivors, and we had 2 bites of the cherry. We had two projects, was to try and find out what mental health service users, survivors, felt about the social model of disability in relation to their own experience, how helpful it was. And I mean, what we got out of that was completely not what you might assume. It was very complicated and therefore really helpful. And it made you realize that you didn't want to do what some of those survivors we spoke with said, having had one kind of model imposed on you to explain you and your experience, then to be railroaded to have another model, the social model of disability, and for people to feel their way or want to have more autonomy and independence in how they understood themselves. And also issues of it being racialized, that different groups come to different conclusions about what might work for them. So it's not, in some ways, it's not the answer that gets the funding, but I don't feel naturally that that's where I'm headed, to work out things, but to have an open mind, try and have an open mind. And what I love about both doing research and writing about it, and writing generally, is not doing things ever on my own. One, it's a terrific responsibility, and 2, it's an inappropriate responsibility. You need to open it up. The only, sorry to natter on, but the only example where I didn't do what I'm saying was when we wanted to set up a grouping of people who lived on benefits to offer their analysis of what kind of welfare state we ought to have. And on that occasion, since we knew from our own experience living on benefits that that was quite a hard way to be living, we thought it would be only fair to get the funding first rather than embroil people. But we had a very open agenda. And so, as opposed to what I'd normally do, which is to work with others to work to get the funding, we got the funding first, and then we could. And I thought that, I mean, I think you could say that's a good and a bad idea, but that's what we chose to do then. It was a really fantastic project to be involved in, to be truthful.
And yeah, and I think I'm just kind of like thinking about, there was a few things that you mentioned there, Peter, that I'm really interested in thinking about. One of them is this kind of like so one of the things that Peer Hub's really kind of keen on is having access to a lot of different kinds of understandings of experience, and I think you talked there about like not moving from dictating someone's story medically to dictating it in a different way. I think there's something really important about that. There doesn't need to be a catch-all for mental health experiences. Like, there's so many different ways that we can understand them, and we don't even have to call them mental health, really. And then also this idea of like collaboration, but then with the complexities of funding systems. And like, one of the things that we've struggled with is like, we want to do stuff and we want to involve people, but we don't want to like say, oh, we're going to do this and then not get the funding and then let people down, or feel like we're letting people down. Or we don't want to kind of be like, oh, well, you know, we think this is going to work, and then commit to something and then find actually that the only people it works for are the 3 people who've come up with the idea. Like, so, and I quite like the idea of, I remember seeing a YouTube video ages ago about the idea that leads to the idea, like this idea of kind of like, this is the idea now, but actually this isn't where we're going to end up. This is just the beginning. And having people be able to take that and move it so you can respond. So Alison, I'm just thinking about some of the stuff that you've done, where you've been working with like third sector organisations to develop the stuff that you've worked on, and you've got a collaboration of people who are trying and not only bring their own perspectives, but also to widen participation in research design rather than just participation in research. I wasn't sure if you might want to talk, following on what Peter was saying about the approach that you take with the people who you work with to develop ideas.
I'm just following the threads also in the chat about the various structural barriers to research involving service users, survivors in universities. And yes, a lot of my work has taken place in the third sector, voluntary sector, charities, whatever. One of the most significant pieces of work that I did certainly was with the Mental Health Foundation many years ago, 20 years ago, in fact. So, in that situation, sometimes you have more freedom and more credibility around, and I definitely say sometimes there, to positively include and work with as survivor researchers with other service users. So yes, there are opportunities in that situation. For example, at the moment, I'm not really doing any research, in inverted commas. I'm doing a couple of evaluations, which therefore are survivor service user led evaluations of services or of projects. But no, I'm not doing any actual research. I mean, the most recent project that I did actually was with a university, which was with Sarah Carr. Some people may be familiar with Sarah Carr. And that was at Middlesex University, in which we did involve survivor researchers, interviewers. And I think somebody, I think it was in the chat, I'm not quite sure. No, I think it was what Peter was saying as well, was this sense in which once you become a professor, like Sarah Carr is, like Peter, like Diana Rose, you know, sometimes you are then dismissed as having also service user experience. And I know that Sarah had a real difficulty in positioning herself in relation to a couple of different bids, because they dismissed the idea that we were, as a group, we were survivor researchers putting forward this bid, and therefore we were working with our own experiential knowledge to put the research together. And it starts to become this professionalization of survivor researchers. You know, I accept that I have that professionalization of, you know, as a survivor researcher, but I also have quite extensive knowledge, experience of using services, and I hope that I work with others in order to expand that, extend that, you know, knowledge, and to bring that knowledge together. But it's very difficult to find a place where the funding can come with you to do what you want to do. Very, very challenging, as several people in the chats have been saying.
And yeah, and I'm seeing those comments starting to come through, and I think one of the things that, so I've encountered this, well, you can't at one time be mad and successful. If you've got mental health issues, then you therefore must be, you know, incapable, excluded, on benefits. And the reality is that a lot of the people who are in those positions, it's a complex social disadvantage that places people in the positions where, and those of us who, so I consider myself to be quite privileged in the fact that I had kind of at one time I was going to say bonkers there, but I don't think that's fair, but like really quite challenged by my mental health issues, and at the other time be supported to be able to work. And that is privilege. It's not, you know, that's privilege. And this kind of idea of, well, so then how do we change that? Well, that's a systemic issue, isn't it? That's looking at the how people are perceived. So it's looking at some of the stigma around what capability in mental health mean, and competency in mental health, like that's stigma. It's not always the reality, it's a stereotype. And then also I think there's something around accountability, for which we don't have. So we've got this co-production agenda, we need lived experience to be involved in X, Y, and Z, but then no accountability for how it's actually conducted. And you end up in a situation where I think you mentioned before, Peter, that people are looking for a specific thing on a bid. So they're looking for a cohort of service users or a cohort of people with lived experience who are contributing, rather than thinking about like people who can bring their skills and experiences and lead and direct a project or be very influential in a project. So I'm going to come to you, Kath, because you sit in amongst this kind of situation and just talking about some of the things that you do. So how do we move from this kind of like, well, we need to co-produce, but we're not going to define what it is, so then you can just pay people 20 quid to do an interview and call it co-production?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like,
I think it's such a grey area at the moment, actually. And I think, you know, for quite some time, certainly within healthcare, you know, we have had patient and public involvement groups, and I think you know, the nature of co-production, I think that's been embedded within research for quite some time, but it seems to change guises over time, and the terminology seems to change, but elements of it kind of run right through. And I think what we need to make sure is that when we are engaging with co-production and with survivor research, that it isn't tokenistic. And I've just seen that someone's popped that in the chat as well. And I think as an ethics committee, you know, we are very conscious of that. And I think it is often obvious if it's a tag-on element to a piece of research, rather than it being driven and led by, and those initial ideas for that project having come from, you know, the people in the know, essentially. I mean, a lot of thinking about what people have said there about funding bids, you know, a lot of funding bids are now requiring patients with experience of the relevant topic area, survivors, etc., to be part of that funding bid. And I think certainly recently, and I mean, in all my years, I think this is quite a recent change in the last sort of 6 months, I would say. I've seen that increasingly on kind of requirements for actually even submitting the funding bid, is that there has to be some element of survivor research within that. And I'm not just meaning as a participant group or as lived experience researchers conducting interviews, for example, but it needs to be embedded right the way through those projects. So, you know, thinking about, certainly a lot of my research that I've done has been around quite unusual aspects of women's health issues, in particular illnesses that aren't very well known about. But the reason I've done that research is because someone who has that lived experience has come to me and said, Kath, can you help me? I've lived with this for 20 years. I know lots of other people who have, you know, but as an academic, I think, you know, I feel, certainly as someone with an interest in women's health, I hope that part of my role is to be a facilitator in kind of helping other people to do that research and answer those questions to try and make a change. And I think that it's important that it isn't just a tag on to a study, but that it runs right the way throughout that research process. And I think, you know, even, you know, at the analysis stage, for example, thinking about qualitative data analysis, you know, I will often, you know, a lot of my projects, I will do an analysis of the data, but someone with lived experience of that will also do an analysis of that data. And we then bring those ideas and thoughts together. And it's bringing those different perspectives. And I think we need to really appreciate all of those different perspectives and those, you know, the differences that people bring to the table.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that when I think about some of the things that I used to do in the role that I had in the NHS when I was implementing peer support, was that kind of, there's almost like a language barrier in working in lived experience work, and then like non-lived experience, like we have different languages in different communities, and thinking about like there isn't just one form of lived experience expertise either. So like I've got expertise in my own experience, I've got expertise in peer support, which is a lived experience field, and I bring with that the collective expertise that I've gained through working with human rights movements and working in structures where human rights are really important at the forefront, like police, and to kind of bring like quite a specialist kind of combination of personal experience, professional experience, and collective advocacy to the work that I do, that I couldn't then take that and apply it to like I'm trying to think of a different form of lived experience expertise that's quite different. So say, for example, design and services for people who've experienced like restraint in hospitals. Like, I haven't had that experience, and I also haven't had a vast amount of work involved in working with people to be able to present like a collective, you know. So I guess what I'm saying is that we have these different roles that different people with lived experience are specialists in, and then we've also got like a whole range of people with loads of different experiences and experiences of the world that are as relevant to mental health research as having like skills that are, and being able to value those different things and recognize those different things is useful. So Peter, I noticed you want to come in. I think, yeah, if you want to come in on that point, yeah, that'd be grand.
I wanted to say something which I think I hope addresses the strong and justified sense of exclusion that people here today and often in other similar settings make clear. You know, we are having this, and someone's already said it, thank you, Vicky, we're having this unusual and privileged opportunity to be with each other, and we don't get enough of these opportunities, and it's very difficult for them to persist. And of course, traditionally and conventionally, ordinary researchers get more opportunities. I'm not trying to say their life is easy, because universities are difficult places now. However, especially if you toe the line, life is a bit more easy than it is for survivor researchers. But I feel that when we're looking at our own oppression, we need to look at the role of others. And I think there's a couple of things I want to stress. First of all, the way in which non-user researchers, non-oppressed people are really encouraged to be dismissive of their own lived experience, whatever that is, bearing in mind we all have very complex, multifaceted identities, which I think then puts them in the position of a kind of internalized oppression by your occupation. You know, I can't understand how some researchers do what they do, take part in projects. They take the researchers who happily sign up to the massive and largely unproductive Me Too type research focused on psychiatric drugs worries me enormously. But the second thing I think is we should be demanding, what should those people be, those who do not identify as service user researchers, what should they be doing so that the space does not keep being taken away from us? One of the earlier studies that Shaping Our Lives did from a user-led perspective was about user knowledge and user networking. And we were there as a national user-led organization. And what we noticed was that non-user-led vol-orgs were taking the ground from user-led ones. So it was very difficult for them to be heard. And that the networking of service users through user-led organizations was being compromised by the advantaged money, legitimacy, power of traditional organizations. So I think, and I don't think it will get a universally negative response. We need, I feel I need to be saying to conventional researchers, and some are very receptive, how can you, instead of taking the ground from us, help us gain the ground? And there will be, and I already, where I'm working now on projects, there are people who want to do that, genuinely want to do it, as well as others who it hasn't crossed their mind.
And I think there's something as well in the fact that I've noticed this kind of, I almost feel like it's like down the line research happening and we haven't really quite got the basics right. And I think that's something that lived experience can bring to the fact that, like, hang on a second, like, we might be interested in this quite specialist approach, but right now people are having experiences of services that are actually like the fundamentals aren't right. The fundamental relationship between service user and mental health service isn't right. And we do want to kind of like step forward in innovation and do stuff, but actually there's some core stuff that we need to figure out first. And I guess the reason why I'm thinking about this is around this idea of, when you've mentioned about people getting onto big projects, and this idea of getting ahead through research that's exciting, when really what I find exciting is the research that says like what a single clinician can do in a team to make someone's experience of services better, or what hearing the stories of people who are marginalized can do to make us think differently about this whole construct of mental health in the first place. And that kind of like back back to basics. I feel like it doesn't feel like a nice phrase, but this kind of like back to like, what are we even talking about in the first place before we get on to kind of like, you know, pharmaceutical interventions? Like are we at a position where we even think that that's good? We've got good evidence to then look into pharmaceutical interventions, and yet so much money is spent on developing drugs and pharmaceuticals because that's where the money is for the research. And I guess so I just want to ask people, actually, while I'm rattling on, if people have got links that they want to share stuff, if you want to drop it into the chat. So I know we've got a lot of researchers who are in the chat who are here today. If people want to share that what they're working on, just drop it into the chat. And for the speakers, like if you want to share the link for Shaping Lives, Peter, and just so that people can like connect in, or if there's anything you're working on, Alison or Kath, that you want to share with people, just start dropping it into the chat. And then what we'll do is we'll pull that list together of things that people can look at to connect into for research stuff. But I guess coming back around to the point that I was trying to make was around like there's something really key, I think, about organisations who are user-led and who are interested in research and development stuff, being able to pull together and compete with, as a collective, with some of the people who are getting a lot of funding just because they've got a lot of resource to write bids, or they've got a lot of time, or that, you know, like, so one of the things I'm going to ask Alison first to talk about, if you don't mind, Alison's around the stuff with Enson, with the Enson being a network of user-led organisations, thinking about how Enson works facilitating people to come together, their survivor researcher network that they've got, like what's happening, I guess, is in terms of networking to support us to have a bit more influence in understanding research.
So I'm involved with Enson as an associate. I'm not actually involved with the Survivor Researcher Network very closely at the moment, so Peter can probably speak better about the Survivor Researcher Network than I can. But certainly Enson is a route through which you know, people, survivors, researchers can advertise, can promote their work, can write blogs, can, you know, that there is a sort of an organisation there now with, you know, some substantial sort of presence that can hopefully sort of promote survivor research in different ways, and I certainly feel that that is the case. But yeah, I'd hand over to Peter about the Survivor Researcher Network.
Yeah, go on, Peter. Sorry, yeah.
So we've been quite an informal grouping of people as survivor researchers interested in, committed to survivor research, under the umbrella of Enson, which Alison's been talking about. That's going to change. We're seeking to become, with the support of Enson, an independent community interest company. And the only thing that keeps our doors closed, insofar as they ever are, is that we haven't got any much money. But and we are trying to get some money, obviously. But we did have a recent event similar to this, and it was terrific. So nice to be amongst a diverse range of people doing and trying to do survivor research. So we have a coordinator, Stephen, and I always get his names wrong. It's Stephen Jeffries, isn't it? Yeah, who's very accessible, and we're trying to become a more visible presence. But the truth is, where traditional organisations saunter along, we have to run to catch up.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure if Stephen was coming today. I've had a look through. I can't see him on the list of attendees, but I think that there is this kind of, I guess, as with a lot of stuff that's going on with from the psychiatric survivor movement, human rights stuff, looking at influence change, like it's that kind of, how do you get in? What's the point? What's the point at which you can, as either as a collective or as somebody who's inside research organizations, like what's the opportunities to just open that up so that we get the opportunity to influence? So Kath, I just wanted to come to you to talk about like the processes in, because obviously research, universities are big players in the research industry, if there is such a thing, but like what are the opportunities to get in to research that's happening in universities and research institutions, and how do they network in a way that we could learn from the way that they collaborate and network to pull stuff together?
Yeah, so I think, sorry, apologies for the cat. So I think that universities, you know, have become more and more keen to collaborate, and I think that collaboration always strengthens our research and funding bids. And I think I would say, you know, for any organisations that are out there, don't be shy to contact us. You know, I think I'm always delighted when I get contacted by an organisation to say, oh, you know, can we have a chat? Can we look at how we can work together? So I think don't, you know, kind of take the lead on that a little bit. I think a lot of universities are now having a lot more involvement with local organisations, with local businesses, and you know, we often have days, networking events, etc., and do sign up to those and come and talk to us. I think also if you you know, can find individuals, you know, academics within universities who are, you know, very supportive of collaboration and working with survivor networks, then that's always a good starting point as well. I think one of the things that I'd just like to kind of go back to that we mentioned before, I think for me what's important is that, you know, when we're talking about this, that we don't have that tokenistic approach to this, and that actually really, you know, but for me, when you're working up bids and things like that, then actually everybody that's involved should be named on that application and should be a co-applicant or even a co-lead if that's possible. I think sometimes what happens is that some things aren't possible because of the guidelines and the remit that we get from funders. It's not necessarily that academics don't want that to be the case. But I think we do need to cost people in appropriately.
I think that is something, and I think that there is, when I look at the research grants that are available that are out there compared to like some of the other more medicalized, like they're quite small compared to some of the more medicalized grants that are available. So I think there is something around showing the value in bids that are putting in and making sure that it's fairly distributed between people. I'm just I'm noticing that there's been a question in the chat, which I think is a great one, around top tips for aspiring service user researchers and key lessons that have been learned so far. And I think that's actually, we've got about just over 5 minutes left. I think that's a really great a great question for us to throw around and close on. So what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to start with you, Kath, and then I'm going to come back round. I'm going to ask you to share your top tips for working with people who don't identify as survivor researchers, so like for collaboration, and then we'll go to Alison and Peter on like their experiences of survivor research and what's really worked for them. So if you can start us off.
Yeah, so I think in kind of top tips in terms of how to collaborate, or
top tips in terms of how to collaborate and how to lift up the voices of survivor researchers as part of your projects. Like what's your experience been of working in collaboration with people with lived experience?
Yeah, well, I think without a shadow of a doubt, my experience has always been hugely positive. And I think it's always, you know, I think the research has always been, I hate the term better, but it's, you know, I think that collaboration has always brought something that I wouldn't have thought of myself. And I think as academics, we need to acknowledge that more and acknowledge our own limitations, actually, and acknowledge that other people have different views and perceptions and takes on things. So I think finding academics and people to work with who are supportive and can provide maybe mentoring and are really kind of willing to be involved, you know, and embed survivor research right throughout a project rather than, as I said, as a bit of a tag on. I think that is really, really important. And I would say, you know, just come and see us. Get in touch, you know, we're always delighted to talk to people.
Thanks, Kath. And Alison, as somebody who works independently, I know there was a question in the chat there around like, are universities interested? And I think that there are universities who are interested and who are trying to figure it out. But I think your experience of working independently with a range of different organisations might be quite helpful in thinking about like top tips for survival research, but also like what other kinds of organizations are doing research, and how open are other kinds of organizations to work and with survivors. Like,
yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? You know, I'm reflecting on this right now, you know, just thinking about it right now. On the one hand, I've worked with a range of different organizations, but it's only in the academic environment that you get to do something that often you get the opportunity to do something really in depth and take time, and you've got so I'm torn really, but I think it's really good to find allies within universities and to really be going with eyes wide open to, you know, the pitfalls of that as well, because some, you know, as you know, maybe it's a good idea for us to be sharing through something like the Survivor Researcher Network. What are good universities to work with? What are good departments to work with who are really respecting our knowledge, and to try and build on that kind of network of, you know, who are good to work with right now, because I do certainly know places that are not so good to work with, and you know, research projects that I have dropped out of because I realised that my knowledge was being marginalised. So yeah, I guess that would be good. I mean, I was suggesting join the Survivor Research Network to a young, you know, up and coming sort of survivor researcher, because finding other people who are doing what you're doing or trying to do what you're trying to do is a really good way to get support and maybe find a mentor through that route. So these are my top tips at the moment, but I don't think, I think there are some substantial barriers, and the chat has been really, really excellent, actually, at sort of revealing some of those barriers that we're up against. So it's been really validating, I think, of different people's experiences to read some of those things in the chat as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that kind of the struggle that's shared across lived experience professional groups as well, of like being valued and being really like passionate about what we're doing, and then hitting these barriers. I think it's really important that we, like, I think the Survivor Research Network is a really positive thing to share that frustration and not feel like we're up against these big structural barriers on our own. And I just want to, one of the things I want to say before I hand over to Peter to kind of close around these top tips is, I think it's really disappointing that one of the things that we're not really talking about is survivor research in NHS, because I think it's one of the areas where, and we're not, and it's not that we're not talking about it because we don't want it, but because it doesn't happen in research departments in the NHS that survivor research is included. And those are the places where they've got, in theory, the most motivation to actually be finding out about this stuff so that it can inform their strategies. And I think it's a real shame that what we're not saying, Peter might say this, I don't know, because I'm kind of anticipating that you're not going to say, Peter, that one of your top tips is going to be to get into a research department in the NHS. But like, I think that we really need to be thinking about, if this is supposed to be an evidence-based model and we've got these nice guidelines that are supposed to be evidence-based, like, why is survivor research not higher on the agenda for NHS institutions who've got research departments? But I'm going to ask, like, that aside, top tips, Peter, for what you found around how to be involved and develop work in survivor research.
I'd first of all say, I think that Alison's absolutely right, that you need support networks, which can be easier said than done, and you need to find people that, you know, are of your mind genuinely. Just to tell you that I was made redundant by Essex University on the basis that that they saw my funding as coming to an end, and that anyone else could do the research I was doing. And then some people at the University of East Anglia found the money to take me on to finish the project. I mean, what can you say? That's commitment, and that's fantastic, and not a very nice experience. And so no one is safe, since I'm very privileged. But I would say this, and I don't say this lightly or to deny all the very realistic constraints people have rightly highlighted, which we need to do more and more, which is, I believe, and this is the expression that runs down my head, we are on the side of the angels, that this is the research there will have to be in the future. There's no question. You know, whenever I, either physically or like this, I'm in such gatherings, you see the people who are concerned with the future of our lives, the future of policy, the future of politics, and the future of research as part of that, for making humanistic change. I mean, I just feel I can't not say it. I cannot cope with the world we live in this country at the moment. I so envy America that whatever limitations he may have, they have not got the same president. We have something truly terrible in charge of us, who's just recruited, which we pay for, a photographer to take nice snaps of his dog. I mean, no benefits if you're disabled, but you've got money for that. But we are on the side of the angels, not only in relation to issues around distress, but issues around diversity in every possible sense, because, you know, more diverse groups are getting involved, and there's no future in something where that's not the case. And we have to stop kidding ourselves that your average person in this society, or indeed any other, is normal, non-disabled, not having elements of what I might call nuttery, speaking for myself. And because, you know, it's like what's happened in places like Leicester. It isn't about minority ethnic groups anymore. It's changing. And with people living longer and pressures being so high, and people not dying before they're even born, and people having children who have impairments that can be transferred, you know, those of us who are different, as has been seen, are going to become more and more of the population, especially as people grow older. So, you know, we are not an outlying group. We're at the heart. That's what I feel. And like every group that's been treated as outliers, you know, we have something very particular to offer, which I think is helpful. I don't think we are alienated from ourselves in the same way as there are such pressures to alienate you from yourself in many of our aspects of life, politics, academia, and so on and so forth. It's, for me, that's what keeps me going.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, you know, we've had a really kind of, like, I feel I could continue this for the rest of the morning, but I know that people have things to do, so I'm not going to insist that people stay for another hour. But I would like to try and do something like this again, or support, you know, other people to be able to do something like this in the future, because I think it's really important that we get to hear these, like, our perspectives and understand what's shared and what's different, and think things through as a collective group. So thank you so much for your time, Peter, Kath, Alison. Thank you so much for coming and spending this time with us this morning. I'm really grateful to you for doing that. And this is the last of our launch series of webinars, but hopefully we're going to have the opportunity to do some things. I'm really interested in the idea of trying to do some I'm trying to get my accent right, because I'm North, right? So I want to say masterclass, but I think it's masterclass up here, right? But I would like to try and see if we can do some stuff in the future, particularly as we're growing our research function in Peer Hub, because we really want to do that. Really excited about that idea. So so thanks everyone, and have a lovely day and a lovely weekend, and hopefully we'll see you around, and keep in touch with us. You know, we'll see what comes of it in the future, and we're going to be in the Survivor Research Network as well, kind of figuring out what's going on. So
thank you
everyone.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Great chat as well. Thank you.